My apologies for having to speak in English. I am not a Russian speaker. My presentation is called Genocide by Other Means, the Centrality of Cultural Destruction to the Erasure of the Peoples. In my following remarks, I will touch upon two issues central to the global challenges Armenia faces today. First is the woeful lack of historical knowledge, especially in the West, about the origins of the violence and cultural destruction perpetrated against Armenians in the Caucasus. The second is a lack of appreciation of the essential link between cultural destruction and the threat that this poses to the very existence of the Armenian people. While some theoreticians distinguish cultural genocide from genocide per se, I do not maintain this distinction. Cultural destruction is a central component of the harm of genocide and acts proscribed by the Genocide Convention. One of the major historical misunderstandings of the Armenian genocide is the belief that the genocide ended with the defeat of the Ottoman Turks in October of 1918. Surveys of historical literature find that for many years, the genocide was dated as occurring over the time period 1915 to 1918. Even today, it is not unusual to see those dates referenced. I argue that this mischaracterization has detrimental effects that have carried forward to the present. We Armenians and our allies may have contributed to this misunderstanding because during our decades-long attempts to gain recognition of the genocide, we often highlighted the date 1915. One only needs to think of the posters, placards, demonstrations, films, editorials that use the date 1915 as a shorthand for the genocide and give prominence to the early stages of the violence. Yet if one studies the history of the period, we know that the genocide continued into the early 1920s and in many ways continues to this very day, as I will argue. Many scholars now generally agree with an endpoint of 1923, a date that coincides with the establishment of the Turkish Republic and the Treaty of Lausanne, which codified the Turkish nationalist territorial gains of historic Armenian lands. The catastrophic consequences of this treaty and its betrayal are further compounded by the fact that Part 8 of the treaty granted amnesty to the perpetrators of the Armenian genocide. The historiography of the genocide has now well established the temporal and spatial spread of the genocide. While most of the violence and killing in the early years of the genocide took place in Anatolia, the eastern provinces of the Armenian highland, and the Syrian desert, the violence steadily shifted east into the Caucasus and the lands of the former Russian Empire. This violence escalated well after the ostensible ceasefire of the 1918 Mudros armistice, despite its requirement for the withdrawal of Turkish forces to pre-war positions. The Turkish military constantly violated Mudros by the infiltration of military agents and agitators into the Caucasus to instigate the Turkic Tatar peoples to take up the mantle of the genocide, a practice that we now see during and after the Second Karabakh War. There is a profound ignorance on the part of the West as to the events in the Southern Caucasus in the years prior to the Bolshevik takeover the region in December 1920. It is on the basis of this ignorance that so-called think tanks and Western media simplifies the Turkish Azerbaijani aggression in Artsakh and Armenia as just another irresolvable ethnic conflict rather than the continuation of the genocidal policy originally formulated by the ideologues of the Committee of the Union in Progress during the Armenian genocide. Given the time constraints of this conference, and the background knowledge of the participants, I have no need to review the early 20th century's history of the violence perpetrated against Armenians in the Caucasus and Karabakh, beginning with the 1905 Armeno-Tartar War, continuing with the 1918 invasion by the Army of Islam, the Muslim uprising in the summer of 1919, the violent consequences of the betrayals, first by the British and then the Soviets in 1920. The results are a geographically precarious and resource-deprived republic, most of whose historic lands were placed outside its arbitrarily drawn borders, the chief of which were the eastern provinces of Turkey, Kars, Nakhchivan, and Artsakh-Karabakh. With regard to Karabakh, most Western observers then as now are ignorant of its central importance to Armenian cultural identity. Unlike many of his military colleagues in the Caucasus at the time, Colonel John C. Plowden, a member of the British mission in Yerevan, in response to the Turkish-Azerbaijani stranglehold on the ever more beleaguered fledgling Armenian Republic, wrote the following in 1919, quote, "Karabakh means more to the Armenians than their religion even, being the cradle of their race and their traditional last sanctuary when their country has been invaded. It is Armenian in every particular and the strongest part of Armenia," end of quote. This leads me to the second point I would like to raise here, the link between cultural destruction and the existential threat it poses to the Armenian people. To put it bluntly, cultural destruction is genocide, full stop. I've made this argument more fully elsewhere, but is worth repeating some of it here. Azerbaijani President Aliyev has taken up the project of the genocide of the Armenians in the Caucasus that was left incomplete back in 1920. In many ways, this project is more insidious and sophisticated than the centuries-long campaign of Turkish government denial of the Ottoman-era genocide of the Armenians and the Greeks. With financial resources fueled by petroleum dollars garnered from an oil industry originally founded by Armenians at the beginning of the 20th century, Azerbaijan has put great efforts into rewriting the history of the region. This has been made all the more easy by the profound lack of knowledge in the West of the genocidal violence that swept into the region in 1918 and the years that followed. This divorcing of past from present facilitates the lazy journalism and media we saw evidenced in the coverage of the September 1920 war, which was exemplified by writers such as Carlotta Gall from the New York Times. The media bias of both sidism that perpetuated a false equivalence between the acts of self-defense by Armenians and the violence of the Azeri Turkish aggressors against civilians is a consequence of this fundamental historical ignorance. Genocide scholars often note a similar phenomena where the perpetrator attempts to switch roles with the victim. The Armenians of Artsakh have become the perpetrators. Unfortunately, even some human rights organizations have slipped down this slippery slope, evidence the alerts posted during the Karabakh War last year by Genocide Watch. Azerbaijan has taken the genocidal project even further than Turkey's century-long endeavors. Historical scholarship and the ever-widening dispersal of knowledge of the Armenian genocide has relegated ignorance of these events to the confines of the Turkish state. This process that began over 40 years ago has even penetrated into Turkish academic and intellectual life 20 years ago, despite the best efforts of President Erdogan to push back against the truth. Yet in Azerbaijan, this project of denial has taken a new and more insidious twist. Layered upon the characterization of the victim as perpetrator is the attempt to erase the history of the victim group. This form of genocide denial may not be unique, but stands out from the more commonplace forms of denial. This is not a denial of the crime per se, but a denial of the existence of the victim group itself. By denying the existence of the group, the nature of the violence perpetrated against individual victims changes. It is important to recall that genocide is a crime against groups. If there is no group, there is no genocide. The physical acts of violence do not disappear, but they can be reattributed to a lesser act or set of wrongdoings, or in some cases, to no wrongdoings at all. This is central to the rhetoric of denialism that attacks the legitimacy of the victim group, reverses the identity of victim and perpetrator, and claims victimhood for the perpetrator. The victim groups are turned into foreigners, aliens, settler colonists, a force from without, assisted by traitors operating within. We saw this in the radical Hutu delegitimizing excuse me, I lost my place. So the radical delegitimizing rhetoric that characterized their fellow Tutsi Rwandans as alien foreign oppressors. This rhetoric was endemic to the radical CUP ideologues who labeled Ottoman Armenians as traitors whose allegiance was to their compatriots in the Russian Empire and not to the Ottoman state. Delegitimizing group identity by erasing the history of the group facilitates this reversal. What has occurred in Azerbaijan for more than 3 decades is a prime example of what I'm talking about here. I will illustrate this with 2 brief examples in the time I have left. First, a little more elaboration on the conceptual apparatus I'm employing in connecting it to the cultural destruction and my unwillingness to separate out cultural genocide from genocide per se. This will take us back to Raphael Lemkin and the development of the concept of genocide. As has been well established, Lemkin's work on developing the concept of genocide finds its conceptual origins in his reflections on the Armenian massacres. As early as 1933, well before the codification of genocide into international law, he emphasized the collective nature of the crime. Quote, "These are attacks carried out against an individual as a member of a collectivity. The goal of the perpetrator is not only to harm an individual, but also to cause damage to the collectivity to which the latter belongs. Offenses of this type bring harm not only to individual rights, but also most especially they undermine the fundamental basis of the social order," end of quote. Such crimes against groups can take a further social dimension when the culture is singled out for attack. Lemkin wrote, quote, "An attack targeting a collectivity can also take the form of systematic and organized destruction of the art and cultural heritage in which the unique genius and achievement of a collectivity are revealed in the fields of science, art, and literature," end of quote. Some would like to separate this cultural destruction from the intentional act of extermination of the peoples by labeling it cultural genocide. And I believe Lemkin would strongly disagree. Remember, genocide is a group crime. Destroying the cultural heritage of the group is the surest way to destroy the group. There's no need to reiterate the century-long evidence of the Turkish state's destruction of Armenian cultural heritage across the Armenian highland and Anatolia. Much work on its recovery has been engaged in by scholars and activists. The ability to engage in this work within Turkey has become much more difficult with the rise of authoritarianism under President Erdogan. As the destruction, whether intentional or natural, accelerates, the work becomes more urgent. Yet this work of recovering now needs to expand beyond the borders of Turkey, because these crimes are fully evident in the Caucasus. The urgency is even greater within Artsakh. I would like to cite some obvious and less obvious examples of the Azerbaijani, Azerbaijan has been doing. A lot of this, Simon went over a lot of this, so I'm not going to cover much of what he described. But let me move on to the two examples. In the more than 2 decades leading up to the November 1920 war in Artsakh, the September war in Artsakh, there had been an ongoing and systematic campaign of erasure of Armenian cultural heritage in the regions under Azeri control, primarily in Nakhchivan and the Armenian population centers of the Republic. All this is well documented and increasingly publicized. And despite all this documentation, no action has been taken by Western nations. As we know, there is an ongoing threat of similar destruction in the newly captured territories from the 2020 war. My purpose here is not to raise the alarm. Those in this audience are well aware of the continuing catastrophic consequences of the successful Azeri-Turkish aggression. What I would like to conclude with are 2 illustrations of Azeri denialism, not of their crimes, but of the very existence of the Armenians in Artsakh and the Caucasus. The first illustration comes out of what is known as the Baku School of Historiography, the main objective of which is to propagate a history employed in school curriculum that delegitimizes the Armenian presence in the Southern Caucasus and Artsakh in particular, by portraying Armenians as late settler colonists, as on the ancestral Turkic lands. While holding no scholarly legitimacy outside Azerbaijan, this pseudo-history is pumped out in thousands of publications, not only to the Azeri public, but to the country's neighbors and to the West. Georgian language books spreading the pseudo-history and hate speech are freely distributed to libraries in Georgia by the Azerbaijani Ministry of Culture and Tourism that contain passages, I just quote one, quote, "Armenians are newcomers to Turkey and the Caucasus and have found perfectly habitable lands. They have taken advantage of the hospitality of the Turkic peoples and have decided to settle here for good. Nevertheless, they have not been able to rid themselves of their gypsy ways and have become the political puppets of powerful states," end of quote. Beautifully illustrated books are produced in English and distributed widely in print and electronic versions. In one example, published online called Karabakh Over the Centuries, it erases all historical references to the Armenian presence in Karabakh. And in a chapter titled, quote, "Proud Albanians, the gems of Armenian medieval architecture are captioned as the pearls of Albanian architecture." The only mention of Armenians is in a chapter which chronicles a one-sided narrative, the Armenian aggression in the First Karabakh War. One can find this book on the shelves of public and university libraries, such as Harvard in the United States. The ignorance in the West is thus being fed lies by the Azeri propaganda machine, adding fuel to the narrative of false equivalence. The second and my last illustration of erasure is equally as dangerous. This involves the whole-scale sanitizing of Azerbaijani literature from before the breakup of the Soviet Union. In 2001, the government started the process of adopting a Latin alphabet, replacing the Cyrillic one imposed by Joseph Stalin. Researchers such as Ararat Serkarian discovered that this process accelerated in 2004 under Aliyev's government. The opportunity opened up for Azeri propagandists to expunge any favorable treatment of Armenians from the Azeri literary canon. The government launched a large campaign to transliterate Soviet-era Azerbaijani literature from Cyrillic alphabet to the Latin. As Sergeyan remarks, quote, during the state-sponsored campaign, more than 2,000 works of fiction have been transliterated with a particular type of censorship. Armenian characters and any kind of ethnic reference to Armenia and Armenians were cleansed from the fictional world of Soviet Azerbaijan, end of quote. Armenians disappeared from the Azerbaijani imaginary. With a clean slate to work with, the government has an easier time to indoctrinate young people with racial stereotypes of Armenians necessary to facilitate their campaign of genocidal violence. Such stereotypes fuel the hatred we saw manifested in the war crimes perpetrated in 2020 and that continue today. Erasing and distorting Armenian cultural heritage, I argue, fits the types of acts outlined in the Genocide Convention. In the words of the convention, these are actions, quote, causing serious bodily or mental harm to the members of the group, quote, end of quote, and are intended to destroy the group, the Armenians of the Caucasus. Cultural destruction is genocide. Thank you very much.